Hello, I'm Andy Pavord, and I'm here to talk about the history of the federal budget. This is the first in a series of videos that will trace the history of the federal budget from the English origins all the way to current controversies. Now, if you're interested in this topic, I'd like you to take a second and hit the subscribe button on your YouTube channel, because that will enable you to be informed when we release the rest of the videos in this series. So let's get started. And let's start with a look at the palaces of kings. Because England developed in a very different way politically than most European countries. And part of that difference was that England alone had a king that was constrained by the requirement to obtain appropriations from Parliament. It was this parliamentary control over finance that made England different, and part of that difference is reflected in the palaces in which the kings lived. Let's take a look at the English palace at Whitehall, where the English kings lived. Now, it's a pretty nice place. If you've ever been there, it's not shabby. It's got some nice rooms and some great artwork. But compared to the palace of a king unconstrained by the requirement to obtain appropriations, such as the King of France, it was just not up to speed. Look at Versailles, an amazing palace with extraordinary, incredible stuff. And it was only possible to build such a great palace because the king was not constrained by any legislature. The king was an absolute monarch who could essentially spend whatever he could get his grubby hands on, whereas the English king was restrained by Parliament. And that's the story we want to talk about in this video. How did the English king become constrained and limited? So it began at the very, very beginning. The very first king of the United England, Ethelred the Unready, you got to love that name, was forced to secure his throne through an agreement with a council of the leading nobilities of the land. And it was because of military necessity, because in 1014, the Danish king Sweyn inflicted a series of defeats on the English armies and captured London. So Ethelred fled to exile in Normandy. Well, he wanted to come back, but he needed the support of the nobles. And so he had a great council. And in that council with the lords, he promised to be a gracious lord and that he would refrain from the previous unjust practice of excessive taxation. And this set a pattern of struggle between the Parliament and the king that pretty much marked English history for 400 years. Now, King John, a couple hundred years later, faced a similar situation where he'd actually been really kind of a mean king. He'd done a lot of taxes, he'd oppressed the people, and he generally got people pretty upset with him, to the extent that they actually rebelled. And there was a major rebellion, and it looked like the rebels were going to win. So King John had to negotiate a deal at a place called Runnymede on the south bank of the River Thames on 10 of June 1215. King John and the lords and the nobles signed an extraordinary agreement that is really part of the cornerstone or the pillar or the foundation or whatever metaphor you want to use of English law and English liberty, the Magna Carta. Now let's look at two chapters in this document, this famous document. Chapter 12, that limits the crown's power to raise revenue without, quote, common council. And you can look at the English language, the antique language there, no scutage. Scutage was a fee that the knights paid to avoid military service that over time evolved into a form of taxation. So this is basically saying no taxation shall be imposed on the kingdom unless by common council of our kingdom. And then you put two exceptions in there, kind of interesting exceptions. One from ransoming our person. So the king, if he was kidnapped, held hostage somewhere, he could raise taxes to pay for his ransom. Now this really happened. Like King Richard, coming back from the Crusades, was captured by the Germans and held hostage. And so they had to raise a huge ransom to get him free. So this exception meant a lot to the kings, because if they could, this is back in the day when they're going to battle and they're leading their armies, and they could be captured, and the king wanted to make sure he could be ransomed. And the other provision exception is for marrying our eldest daughter. So the king, for only his eldest daughter, could raise taxes to provide for her marriage. But other than that, it had to be approved by Common Council. And chapter 14 talks about what the Common Council is. How do you obtain Common Council? And it basically sets a pattern of who's going to get called, and they have to have 40 days of notice, and it has to be at a fixed place, and people have warnings, and there has to be letters and all that kind of stuff. So it couldn't just be the king had to announce that, oh yeah, I have Common Council. The king had to go to Parliament, to a version of Parliament. So this set up the idea that the king needs Parliament to raise taxes. And that started a 473-year struggle to define what that meant. What did it mean to say that the king has to get permission to raise taxes? And that was not finally settled until the Glorious Revolution of 1688. So let's take a look at what happened next. Now, what the Magna Carta set up is that the king had two kinds of revenue. There was ordinary revenue, and this revenue belonged to the king. It was the king's money to do what he or if it was a queen, what she wanted to do with it. It did not require the consent of Parliament. Now, Blackstone, the great English legal authority, listed 18 sources of the revenue for the king. Things like rents, feudal dues, and the confiscation of lands of, quote, idiots and lunatics. So the king was sort of expected to live within the budget of the ordinary revenue in normal times. But they recognized that extraordinary revenue could be required from time to time, specifically, generally, mostly for wars. And so the king, if he wanted to finance a war, had to go to Parliament and get them to approve a loan. Taxes. But what did this lead to? As early as the 13th century, Parliament began to assert the right to appropriate extraordinary revenue. And what that basically meant is that the Parliament said, if you're going to raise taxes, we're going to tell you what you spend the money for. The king, to get Parliament's consent, had to agree to spend the revenue in accordance with Parliament's direction. And almost always that was limited for the defense of the realm. And there's an example of this in 1425 on the right here, where Parliament granted King Henry VI extraordinary revenues for, quote, for the defense of said realm of England. But then the law further stated, which guarantees of subsidies be made by said commons on conditions forthwith. That is to say, that is no part of it may be used for any other use, but only in and for the defense of said realm. And of course, there's the original spelling, and I didn't probably say it right, but you get the gist of it. So then Parliament took the next step in the 1400s. By 1406, Parliament established auditors to make sure that the kings were spending their money in accordance with the appropriation. And that began the modern evolution of the modern English system of appropriations laws. Now, it evolved over time. It didn't happen overnight. The evolution progressed under the Lancaster kings, Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VI, roughly from 1413 to 1471. And during this period, Parliament's appropriations power becomes institutionalized. It becomes regularized, mainly because they're fighting a lot of wars, and they have to get the revenue to fight the wars. And Parliament really didn't want the king to spend money on anything but the fighting of wars. They didn't want to pay taxes for a big giant palace like the French. And so they put really stringent conditions on appropriations. For example, they would only physically give the money. And remember, this is back, there's no digital currency back then. It's gold, it's coins. They would only physically give it to the king when he would get on the boat to go off to war. So they're controlling expenditures, or at least trying to. But then came the Tudor period with the famous kings, Henry VII, Henry VIII, and Elizabeth I. Now, during this period, the crown is relatively frugal. They don't go excessively spending, but they're also successful. They basically are winning their wars. Elizabeth I defeats the Spanish Armada, and this makes Parliament a little bit deferential to the throne. Not completely, but at least a little bit. And so Henry VII, he faces complaints that the crown is using the threat of war to obtain appropriations that it then uses for other purposes. And then under Henry VIII and subsequent tutors, they start using the provisions, avoiding the provisions of appropriations, and start spending the money kind of how they see fit. Because, they're successful kings and Parliament recognizes it. So they kind of start evading the appropriation laws. And under Henry VIII, tax revenue starts to pay for standard items such as the stables and gifts and household expenses of the princes. Because by the reign of Elizabeth I, the crown is now paying for a large percentage of the regular peacetime costs out of tax receipts. So this is an evolution, a change. Originally, taxation is for the extraordinary events for war, and now under the Tudors, it becomes part of the regular process of government. Taxation funds most of government. Now, this leads to a crisis under the Stuarts, because this is a period of very serious conflict over appropriations. Part of this is because state expenses, you couldn't even make the pretense that they're going to be met by the, quote, ordinary revenue. And James I and James II just can't manage their finances. They're big spenders. And what's worse, they're not very successful militarily. So they don't have the prestige that Elizabeth I had. And so Charles I, when he becomes king, he starts going off and fighting foreign wars. And he resorts to taxation. And then Parliament says, nope, we don't want to pay for taxation. And so he declared that he had the prerogative to tax his subjects. Divine right of kings, I'm not going to pay attention to Parliament. And that's the way it is. Well, not really, because that led to a civil war, and the parliamentary forces eventually won, and Charles lost his head. He got executed, and part of it was religious fights. A big part of it was religious controversy between the Puritans and the regular Church of England, but a lot of it was also over appropriations. So that set up the role of Oliver Cromwell, the leading general of Parliament's army. He establishes the Commonwealth, declares himself the protector, kind of a dictator, and he rules for a while. But the Commonwealth, during this period, the Commonwealth accustoms the people to the idea that national finances are managed by Parliament. But then Cromwell dies, and there's no real successor, and the Commonwealth hasn't been all that successful. So the nobility asked King Charles II, whose father, Charles I, was executed, to come back and be a king again. So the initial restoration of Charles II, the restoration of the crown, led to large grants of revenue with very few strings attached. But then Charles II started fighting foreign wars, and that distrust between Parliament and the king frayed again. And so Parliament started giving more specific appropriations and put in more stringent auditing provisions. And there was also now a fear of a standing army that wanted the controls. Because remember, Cromwell had established essentially a military dictatorship with a standing army, and the English people are nervous about that. So then we have something called the Glorious Revolution, which is really the turning point in English history in a lot of ways. So James II, Charles dies without a son, and his brother, James II, becomes a Catholic king of England. Now that, England's a Protestant country. It's fought wars against the Catholic countries, and Catholicism is, feared by the average English person. But they were okay with a Catholic king as long as he didn't have a Catholic heir. And the king had only a daughter at first, or had a daughter who was his heir, Mary, and Mary was a Protestant. And she married William of Orange, the ruler of the Netherlands. But then the king got married again, and he had a Catholic son, and that freaked everyone out. And so you had another revolution. But this was the glorious revolution because William and Orange, who was a tough, hard military leader, he'd been fighting the French in the Netherlands for years. He brought over a battle-tested army with the support of the English nobles and the English public. The royal army melted away, and William established himself as king, and his daughter Mary as queen. So his wife Mary is queen. Sorry about that. His wife Mary is queen. So now William, who is really concerned more about the Netherlands, wants to win the war in Netherlands and wants money. He accepts the idea that the English king is limited by law, and he accepts the idea that he needs the consent of Parliament to rule in finances. Now, he immediately brings England into the wars against Louis XIV of France, and that's his main motivation here. But he needs money to fight the war. So in 1695, they established the Bank of England to borrow money to fight France. And this begins the process of creating the fiscal military state that within a generation made the British Empire the most powerful nation in the world in Europe since Rome. Now, the fiscal military state that evolved in the 18th century was really a thing of marvel. So here, in contrast to the rest of Europe, where the kings are absolutists, ruling by divine right, the king rules with parliamentary consent. And what this means is that it creates the ability for efficient taxation to raise large amounts of revenue. Because it turns out that if people consent to pay taxes, they're more likely to actually pay taxes. And England is able to build an efficient bureaucracy to collect those taxes. And with a stable amount of revenue from a stable revenue stream, what does that allow you to do? Borrow money on an unprecedented scale. This is key to England's winning the wars against the French, because France is a bigger country. France has more population. It grows more food. It has more stuff. It has more soldiers. But it is not as efficient as the British fiscal military state. So the English then learn to be very efficient in managers that allows them to supply armies and navies that can go all across the world. I mean, it's really extraordinary when you think about the English ability in the 18th century. This is, before the internet, before email, before, steamships, to move huge forces across the globe. Now, so this led to victories. The British won the 7-Year War. They were extraordinarily successful. English commerce rules the world, and England becomes an incredibly wealthy country. And now, though, there's the worry about instability, right? All this money, a lot of change, a lot of chaos. So the English came up with a system, and it was Robert Walpole, the first English prime minister, who sort of developed this, that the way you get control of Parliament is you buy the members of Parliament. You just give them corruption. You pay them, you give them stipends, you give them odd jobs they never have to show up to that pay a lot of money. And so this is a profound thing, that corruption is used to manage in English politics. Now, one key thing that we're going to talk about later is that in England at this time, the way you became rich is you got the favor of the king, the favor of the English Parliament. So this means that corruption is used to maintain social hierarchy. The hierarchical society, Britain is a very hierarchical society. There's the king, there's the nobility, and there's the commons. And what keeps that in place is the revenue from the fiscal military state, from colonialism, and the ability to distribute it through corruption to the members of the nobility. And that is the secret of the English success, the fiscal military state built upon the idea of efficient taxation with the idea of parliamentary consent for appropriations. Now, in the next video, we're going to talk about what did the British colonials in America think about the fiscal military state? What did the Americans think about this? And just a hint, there was a revolution. So let's talk about some references, just showing you the reference. These references are going to be available And the slides will be available on a LinkedIn site at the American Association for the Budget and Program Analysis Group site. That's an organization I'm the president of. I hope you consider joining it if you're interested in budget issues. But with that, until next time, see you then.